so I will do that. And I'd just like to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Greater Kulin Nation, on which my poems were also written, and that this land has been part of the daily life of the Wurundjeri people for millennia, and words and songs in the Woiwurrung language have been spoken and sung to this country. So I want to recognise that and just pay my deepest respects to the elders past and present, and feel free to message in the chat if you're on lands in Australia and want to acknowledge them. And so I'll start just with we're going to start by introducing each other. So I will introduce Belle. So Belle Ling is a Hong Kong poet who has lived in Australia. She did her PhD study in creative writing at the University of Queensland, and her poems have been widely acknowledged with prizes and awards, including the Peter Porter Poetry Prize, the Arts Queensland Thomas Shapcott Poetry Prize, Aesthetica's Creative Writing Award, the Oxford Brookes International Poetry Competition, and the Playa Residency Fellowship in Oregon. And her forthcoming debut book of poetry, titled Nebulous, Vertigo, will be published by Tupelo Press in the United States next year, so in 2025. And she is now teaching at the University of Hong Kong. And I thought I'd also read you my endorsement for this forthcoming book, because I have read this book and really, really enjoyed it. So I wrote, in Nebulous Vertigo, Belle Ling dances across the page with a highly original voice, chasing an eye that flees from itself and these, she writes, bright sorrows under the sun. The visceral pleasures of the present fall into our hands as Ling encounters objects, rain, soybeans, tangerines, phones, tea, mirrors, tofu, in pursuit of her evanescent self. Weaving together poems, visual artworks, and ideographs, Ling overleaps the grids and borders of cultures and genres with delicious ease, taking us with her in astonishing poems, as she writes, breathe, be ricocheted, be wings. So,
thank you, Judith. It's a very good introduction. Okay, so it's my turn. So Judith Bishop is an Australian poet. He is now a research fellow in language and AI at Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She has published a trilogy of poetry collections focused on time, starting with Event in 2007, followed by Interval in 2018, and now Circadia, which was released by the University of Queensland Press this month. Judith's poetry has won numerous awards, including an Academy of American Poets Award, the Peter Porter Poetry Prize in 2006 and 2011, the Anne Adler Award for First Collection, and then New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, Kenneth Slessor Prize for Interval.
Thank you, Belle. Yeah. So we have a set of questions that we're going to ask each other, and we're going to pass the baton to and fro between us for this conversation. Belle, did you want to open by reading your favorite shorter poem from your book and then just telling us a bit about it?
Yeah. So maybe I'm going to read it and I will talk a little bit about it. So this poem is called Dining with Whom. Dining with whom? The sky watches like yesterday. The stars haven't finished predestining. Dinner comes. Windows can't eat. The door refrains from closing. Candles burning their bruised eyes, says, I, the anonymous I. The floor dares not step forward. That's why I move closer to the table. Around the ethereal, the air beckons. Can you come back tomorrow? But for whose tomorrow I'm waiting? And I think tomorrow will stay so fastidiously like you being with me that you, regardless in the spaces, keep surrounding this I, the solitary I. Stay well, my dear. You can't flee I, the intriguing I. And now even just as I breathe, I nearly hit you. So this is a poem about like, I'm imagining that like whom I'm actually dining with, like in an empty room. And then I always think like even when you're eating alone, it seems like there is a kind of like imaginary I that you are actually staying with, and this is the imaginary I that I'm imagining when I'm eating in an empty room.
I loved as well, Belle, how you're naming the objects to the inanimate objects around you, which are also in a way your company. As you're dining alone, you're naming like the window and the various
Door, table.
Yeah, that are keeping you company in your everyday dining. So that was lovely. All right, I will read a book from Circadia. So a poem from Circadia, called Morning, 14th June 2020. So this was a poem that was written during the COVID lockdowns, which were very, very long in Melbourne. And we were very fortunate to have a bush reserve near us, which has kangaroos in it. And my family and I were taking lots of walks there and looking at the kangaroos, and many other people were also starting to take walks there just to get out of their houses. So it was becoming quite busy in the bush. And I felt that we were sometimes disturbing the kangaroos rather a lot. So this is the poem I wrote about that. Morning, 14th June 2020. So I walked away and broke the glass in which we listened to each other, were within each other, as rain disappears into the earth. Puddles in the path, like a shining set of stations. Take me to the wet leaves, their constellations undiminished by morning. The kangaroo offering her belly to the sun, ears flickering at calls. How we colonize the earth with our sound, the youngest shouting to each other, and all the mute listeners in alarm. She rose on an elbow as I came, and lowered in time. I didn't go on. No one should break the presence of another to the sun. Often in the morning and evening, we'll see the kangaroos there, literally sort of propped on their elbows and enjoying the sun. And you just have that real sense of not wanting to disturb their peace. Their connection with the sun.
Yeah, I really like that kind of organic, as you said, the organic connection with the sun. Like the last line is that like no one should break the presence of others to the sun. So it seems like we have our own kind of minute and detailed and very private connection to that sun.
Yeah, that's right. It gives us warmth and it helps us to flourish. So it's also that idea of flourishing and not undermining anyone else's need to flourish, I suppose, is also what that poem's about. So our next question was, how did this book start out? So Belle, how did Nebulous Vertigo come about?
Actually, I wrote this book at the very beginning of my PhD journey. And then when I started my PhD, I actually had to write an exegesis for my creative writing PhD. And then the exegesis, I chose the topic for my exegesis was Pablo Neruda, so a poet from Chile. And then he had the Nobel Prize in 1971. And he wrote 4 volumes of odes. So these are all odes about like elemental objects, like a large tuna in the supermarket, or like oil sputtering French fries, or like he would praise like broken things, or just the spoon molded by man's most ancient hands, or onion or lemons. So I'm really impressed by like how just the very everyday, mundane, and very down-to-earth objects could be sung and praised in such a way that I've never imagined. And then, so it seems like we have so much beauty of the present that was not ever investigated. And then, so we just like let it pass. And then, so I think like there's so much like in-depth like philosophy, or so much in-depth like underpinnings of like philosophy that we can learn and like from our everyday life. And then, so I think, yes, so this is how my book started. So because my book like revolves around so many like handlings and preparations of food. that how we can learn the dynamics of human connections and interactions, and our like something about our daydreaming or memory, like some of the under-discovered like histories, or like something that we have like buried in our subconsciousness. And, yeah, so this is how my book started. And how about you, Judith?
Yeah, so Circadia, I guess when I was writing Interval, my last book, I started already thinking about what the next book would be. And Interval was very much a book about looking back to the past and looking forward to the future and the uncertainty of the future. That was in 2018, and like climate change seemed very, very urgent and pressing, and obviously still is, but particularly at that time. So I wanted Circadia to be a book which was about reconnecting with the present time and the feeling of being alive and the feeling of existence, which just started to feel that much more urgent, I suppose, because of everything that was going on in the world, also with technology development at that time as well. So Circadia, I came up with this, actually, it's the title of a poem in Interval. So that's something I do, is I steal the title of a poem from one of the previous book and make it the title of the next book. So I also did that with Event and Interval. But Circadia was a coined term that sort of smushed together circadian, so the rhythms of the body, because embodiment is very important to me, and the idea of this ideal Arcadia, which was in Virgil. It was the sort of pastoral ideal. And what I wanted to convey was, just the beauty and the mystery of the everyday life that we live, and that feeling of being alive, being so important. But the book, as I started to write, it was inflected in a few ways by things that happened in the world and in my life that were not so joyful, I suppose. There was COVID, obviously, and there was a lot of shock over the deaths associated with COVID, and more uncertainty with that. And then the war in Ukraine also happened, which again, I wrote poems reflecting on that and kind of trying to register those experiences, those images that I was seeing. So yeah, it started off with one conception. I think it just kind of got a bit knocked sideways by the events in the world, but then started to move again in that direction of really registering everyday events. So there's lots of poems that have the names are the dates that those poems were written, or maybe I saw something on that day that inspired a poem. So yeah, I kind of brought it back, reeled it back to the everyday and the feeling of the everyday as much as I could.
That's really interesting, because like you started off with like trying to work on a book with the beauty of the, and then when it came back to reality, and then like, different crises like hit through, like in that period of time, like COVID and like climate change, and then Ukraine, and then the war. So how did that actually make you readjust or recalibrate, or kind of go back to the original vision of your book? There's the beauty, like, yeah.
Yeah, I think it really, in response to that, I mean, it's interesting because so Arcadia, also, that idea of Arcadia comes from, or I got it from a painting by Poussin, which has a tomb, and it has the inscription "Et in Arcadia ego," which is interpreted as death too is in Arcadia. So I have that sense that, death does kind of remind us of how precious life and being alive and the feeling of being alive is. So I use that, but then I also had the idea of a series of works that would be poems that would be about works of art, and how they also capture something of the feeling of life in their art. So that's how I kind of came out of that, and created sort of more upward arc, I suppose, out of those initial kind of darker poems in the book.
Wow. Yeah. So it seems like the beauty is not just all about positivity, but
No,
it's more thorough recognition of what life really is.
yes, and I think it's the same in your poems as well. As there is that balance, isn't there, of the registering the everyday and how important those things about you are. But there's also a deeper, somewhat darker,
Yeah.
something happening below the surface in the
Yeah.
poem. I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, like I am very fascinated about Taoism, the Taoist philosophy, like from Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. And I think their philosophy makes me recognize, for example, like how we always feel like tied emptiness, like with negativity, like or kind of like you always have to strive or you always have to achieve and you always have to be the best and you have to grab everything, and this is very positive. But like for Taoist philosophy, it's just the opposite, because like emptiness and fullness, and like they are come hand in hand and they are inseparable. And then so when you go through crisis, loss, or trials, or suffering, or pain, and actually you're going through another sense of fullness.
Mm.
So this is also what I want to convey in my book. But sometimes so in this book, because this is my first book, so I'm still journeying with this concept of emptiness and how to make this emptiness kind of like fruitful. Uh, like how to resuscitate that kind of vibrancy of the emptiness.
Mm. I can already see that, coming through in the way that you use spacing on the page, and even the images and the images of the grids that you have. I suppose there is that, there's space there, and yeah, it's kind of enclosed space, but that's, maybe you can touch on that a bit after. But I was actually wanting to ask you about that. Your epigraph to the book, it is always present within you. You can use it any way you want. What is the it there that you're talking about?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So I'm just thinking, so when I chose this epigraph, I thought that, oh, it might sound a little bit ambiguous to the reader because they don't know what it is referring to, but I want to leave this ambiguity at the very beginning and let the reader try to find it out. And actually this it is something, because I have in my book, so one of the main tenets that I always go back to is the Chinese paper grids. Because in the English copybook, when you practice English calligraphy, like you always have the lines, right? 5 lines. But then for Chinese writing, when we practice writing Chinese characters, I think like Simon would know. And then so we use like the grids paper, the paper grids. So you have to write the Chinese characters within a grid, a square. So this is the paper that we use to practice Chinese writing. And in my manuscript, so there are different variations of the squares, different imaginations of the squares, and how we can go beyond the squares, and how I reimagine a Chinese character into a speaking persona, and then how this speaking persona, how she actually narrates her story, like in different ways. So her story with her parents, and then her story with different uncles, or her story with herself, her story with her lovers. And then so go back to what you're asking, what is the it? So in the epigraph I put, let me get it back. So the epigraph is, it is always present within you. You can use it any way you want. So that it is like the variation of your memories, just like the variations of the Chinese characters, the variations of the Chinese scripts that you bring along with your imagination, with your childhood, with your memories. So like something that you always like stay with it to imagine, to daydream.
That's lovely. That's very rich. And there are, of course, a lot of memories in this book. And yeah, in various configurations with various voices. So that's lovely to, yeah, to have that background. And just one other thing I was thinking about, because this is sort of talking about our vision of the everyday, and I was thinking about how important attention is as well as part of that vision of the everyday. And you were talking about, Neruda, and that that attention to very mundane objects that are around us, like the spoon, or or something that we're eating. And recently I was reading this marvelous book called Forms of Poetic Attention by Lucy Alford. I thought I'd just read a couple of sentences because I love the way she puts it in terms of the importance of attention to poetry. So she says, "But what is formed by and in poetic language is an event of attention generated in the acts of both reading and writing. I suggest that a poem might be better understood not simply as a gathering of composed formal features, but as an instrument for tuning and composing the attention." And I just love that, because it also connects with me, for me, with the kind of the musicality of language and the way that language in a poem unfolds in time. Reading is an act in time that unfolds as you move through the words on the page, and there is an experiential feeling to reading the words in the poem, as well as registering what they're about, and seeing the sights or hearing the sounds that are being described. So yeah, I love how she connects that with this idea of attunement and composing the attention. So yeah,
Like how you says, like it's an event of in attention, or event of attention.
yeah,
Right?
the event of attention. So attention being both something that is active, but also something that, like, it's an event is something that happens to us as well. So, and it's interesting, in English we'll say, something grabbed my attention, or you held my attention, right? And that poem I read about the kangaroo, the first one I read, was about that moment, how, and I say that, where it's like that we were within each other. It's actually because the image of me is in the kangaroo's mind, and I am, I have the kangaroo in my mind, and so we are literally holding each other, through attention. So I find that very beautiful, that moment of connection through attention.
Yeah, especially that kind of like porosity, like in that space and time. So it seems like you can't differentiate, because like with our human experience, like you can experience space without time.
That's
So
right.
it seems like there's kind of like interweaving of space and time, that kind of porosity, and then or like overlapping in a certain moment, and that brings forward that kind of performance of language.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for both of us, that the space on the page and the time of the poem are both important elements that we compose our poetry with. So it was quite thrilling for me to read your manuscript and see how you're doing some of the things that I feel are very important for my poetry as well. So that was lovely. We should keep going, shouldn't we, with our questions? What is our next question? Oh, okay. So we've got the next question was, read a poem each that illustrates our vision of the everyday. So do you want to lead off?
Yeah. So I'm going to read a poem on miso soup. So it's about food again. So actually, I really, it is one of my very best favorites in my collection on miso soup. Because I think like I really like miso soup, and I like it because of its mysterious obscurity. So it's clearly obscure, but it's obscurely clear as well. So actually I have this idea. Originally I wrote this poem because I read a sentence in a magazine. So that magazine was introducing a place in Hokkaido. So a place So it is a vacation place, a place for you to do meditation and have holidays. And then in that place, when it's introducing that place, so the writer put forward a sentence that is to sit and to forget. And this is also the name of that place called Submarine Ryokan. So it's in Japanese. So submarine, that means is sit and to forget in a forest. So this is submarine. So actually this reminds me so much of miso soup and my experience of that kind of Zen spirit and Zen vibe of miso soup. And this is how this poem started. Read it. Be quiet in the miso soup. This pond is a far province of many secrets. Granules, a forlorn wind slings a jut of grit, of kelp, of sterns. Sparks poking the running of salt, of jaws, of soil. I know not how a real pleats occurred with so many curls that a slit on a tiny head grips a rice spring that dissolves, but not quite, reaches the scent of rains and the ripples to come. I know not from where these grains between a shave and a shattering shave are rift waves surging in sheaths, in blades, in wings. That clarity is a sharp spike, too much, too little to know. Some say pigs oaring around, look at the lipids. Some say hands dropping eggs. Look, the yolk threads, languid yellow. If there is too much or too little, that makes me know not. Let me go back to the center of it all, to sit and to forget, to sit and to forget.
I just love the way I was really listening to the sounds and how very visceral the sounds are, and how the substances in the miso soup are very, very vividly described. It's very physical sense of that soup that we get through your poem. So yeah, I could really, I love miso soup too. I was imagining the soup as you're describing it. So yeah, wonderful. So my next poem is called, let me just find it. It is called Recital. A number of the poems, as I mentioned, have dates, and this one also has a place. It was inspired by a concert at the Melbourne Recital Centre in 2018. Yeah, I think this poem is probably fairly self-explanatory, but it was this was actually the first poem that I wrote for this book, and it was inspired by reading William Carlos Williams. I think it was Asphodel, that greeny flower, and he has this triadic three lines together and sort of moving back and forth on the page, and I used something like that form for this poem. Recital. Watching others love is something many do, I guess. Not so much a pastime as a mode of grasping gentleness the present time withholds, bending without feeling to stroke some tired cheek unseen as the other bends truly and receives. Here begins our concert in the hush of restraint. Love embarrasses. It is hard to know why. It shows itself in fits, like a cough blurted out to trouble others as they wrestle to listen when required, love aside. Gesture is the accident of love, its naked speech. I can't think what other language would have a word for it. This child pulling closed the lapels of her father's suit. Yeah, often in my poems there is there is something that I have seen or heard that will give rise to the poem. And in this instance, it was actually seeing this child in this very protective gesture of just closing those lapels of her father's suit. And so, yeah, I had to write the poem to understand what it was that I wanted to say about that side.
So I can see like there's so much like mentioning of time in your poems. So for example, here you have like, I guess not so much a past time as a mode of grasping gentleness, the present time withholds. And then so I'm just thinking, because like I know you have also written the other two collections like Event Interval, they're also related to the time. So why do you find time so fascinating about your vision of the everyday?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. So I blame it on philosophy classes. When I was an undergraduate, I took some classes in second and third year in contemporary European philosophy and the phenomenologists, as they're called, which are the philosophers of perception, how we perceive the world. And I was just so taken by the ways that they described being and existence, and how time and being a time are related. And yeah, so that's where I think it really kind of started for me. And then and I think that resonated, also with my own sense that things often just strike my attention, and that I would start thinking about it and wanted to write a poem about it. So the idea of perception and how meaning comes from things we see, and how we're changed by what we see, that all kind of came together first in the event. So there I was kind of exploring the different kinds of, the event of feeling and falling in love, or a bird flying by, and how I was changed by those. And then Interval, as I said, was more about, that feeling of kind of being in the middle of life and not being quite sure where things would go in terms of the future. And then trying to kind of ground myself more, I suppose, in the present time, and bring the reader hopefully with me.
So like this kind of like trilogy of collections, like event is like, or something happened, so it's like a dot on timeline. And then you have like interval, it's like, oh, in between, where should I go, which direction? And then Circadia is like the flow of time that you try to ground yourself, like to move with that flow again.
Yeah, that's right. But I think in each of these books, still events are important as sort of the trigger for a poem, or something that structures a poem. And in betweenness as well is really important in Circadia as well, because with images of the skin and windows and those two worlds, like the inside world and the outside world, and how those interact.
Sure. So in my poetry, I'm also very fascinated, especially about windows and mirror.
Yes.
I mentioned it in the email as well, like to you.
Yeah. Talk about the mirror and what it means in your work, because it's fascinating.
It's very interesting because I remember, like, for example, in Chinese culture, so we have the philosophy called feng shui. That is how you establish that kind of harmony with the environment, so you can have that kind of easiness and comfort when you're living at home. So this is the Chinese philosophy of feng shui, and mirror plays a very important role. And this makes me very fascinated with mirror, the idea of mirror. So for example, mirror can augment the sense of space and magnify the sense of space. But at the same time, they said that mirror could also augment the kind of like horror, because it seems you see a double me. So it creates confusion. So also like mirror can double the energy of something. So you can't put the mirror in whatever places you want. And then so you have to carefully use the mirror, although mirror is a very good tool of restructuring the energy of the environment. And then so this is how, so in my poems, when I think of mirror, so it's kind of like a kind of transformative experience, that how it makes you look into yourself again. but like it seems that it poses a question, it poses an inquiry about yourself because it leads you towards further investigation of yourself. But it doesn't give you a very direct and exact answer.
No, that's so interesting, because I was just thinking too, you have the image of the mirror as the face as well in your poem.
Yeah,
The
the
face.
beginning poem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems we always wear this face and we always wear the mirror, that this face, this mirror is always pushing us like forward to go outside in order to look back.
That's fascinating. And also I noticed that you often double words, and maybe I don't know whether that's related to the mirroring, but you love to double up words, in maybe that's unrelated, but anyway, it's a lovely sort of rhythmic aspect of your work, that you will have the same word repeated twice sometimes. And
because the doubling, it seems like a summoning, it seems like a calling. So it puts forward a kind of like calling, and later in the book, I would like to respond to that calling. So you can see some of the things that keep repeating or keep popping up and keep coming back. So because it's kind of like responding. So I think the doubling is kind of like doubling of the words is kind of gesture, a kind of gesture towards like how you are going to respond to this calling.
Okay, that's lovely. Okay, all right. What are we talking about next? Let me see. So
the arc of the book.
Right, the arc of the book. Thank you. Yeah, we might have to keep moving. So yeah, do you want to talk about, so we were both very interested in this idea of the architecture of the book as a whole, right? And how how that's structured. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it actually, so I just like mentioned a little bit of it. So I structured the book according to the call and response. So the very beginning of the poem is related to fish, and then the last poem is also related to fish, but they are touching upon different kinds of like self-reflections. And then so the very first poem is like, so I compare myself to a fish, and then chasing everything back about this I, which is not a stable self. And then so like how at the end I'm coming back, and then to have the fish to look at me. So it seems that they look at me as if I were their dream. And then and then so in between I will have a lot of like, for example, like self-inquiries and then self-doubts, and then so in face of different kinds of losses, and then so, and then the force that's actually driving the whole book is often the force of breaking confines, breaking limitations. And then because like in my poems there are lots of like childhood memories of like how primary school teachers always yelling at me, and so how parents misunderstanding me, and then so like, but how I try to like break through these kind of cultural norms, or always like following rules and always listening to the authoritative figures, and how you can break these confines and like finding your own voice. But at the end, like still like there is not like a really strong and solid voice, because I wanted to, and I want the whole book to end at a very like a kind of like to be continued, that kind of
maybe the trilogy here too in the making.
So how about you?
Oh, I was just going to say, I really enjoyed how those threads in your book, they weave throughout the mirror, and there's also and the grids, that actual visual element of the grid, and your writing breaking out of that and sort of messing up the grid is really, really lovely. You also have this word sorry, actually, that comes through a lot.
It's very important. That's very interesting because I remember at my very first year of my undergrad, so because I studied in the School of English, and then my tutor would say to us in the tutorial, like, don't always say sorry. And then, so because you don't always need to apologize because like sometimes it is not your responsibility and then you are not held to take responsibility for it. But I think in Chinese culture, we always need to say, excuse me and sorry, like a little bit like Japanese, because it seems like we always think, oh, this is what I have to take care of. And then so I don't want to disturb the others. And then so it's more kind of like that kind of connectedness. Like so we are not just individuals, but we are a community. So we are always have to say sorry. So if you can see any international students in Australia, so I recognize my friends from Hong Kong, they always say sorry, like if they bump into each other, or if they are pumped by the others, and then so they will also say sorry. If they want to get through a crowd, they will say sorry. They're sorry everywhere. And
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I particularly love the poem where you're looking at a fish on your plate, a cod, and you're saying sorry fish, but you're here. It's a beautiful moment. Yeah, so in terms of the sort of architecture of Circadia, I'm always very conscious of the sections in the book and what's kind of the arc of the way the book moves through those sections, as if they were kind of big rooms in the book. So I do a lot of pushing poems around and seeing where they want to belong in the manuscript. I noticed that. So Circadia has 5 sections. Event also had 5. Interval has 4. So and there are kind of thematic things going on in each section in Circadia. So it opens with kind of things around life and death, more or less, existence, non-existence. Then there's a section of poems about the war in Ukraine, written in the very earliest days of that war, and just trying to register what was happening there and the painfulness of that. And then there's another section about poems of personal connection and disconnection, and that's where there's lots of these images of windows and water surfaces in one. An old friend and I are looking up from the surface of a river as if from under. So again, there's that sense of looking through the boundaries from one world into another, I suppose, from the present into the past there. Then I had a lot of fun and joy writing this series of poems about some of my favorite artists, women and non-binary artists, where I was trying to do something different from the typical, there's this tradition of writing poems called ekphrastic poems, which is poems about art. And they're often descriptions of artworks. And I wanted to do something different. I wanted to, again, try and capture something about the energy and the feeling of life in those artworks. Because to me, that's what's distinctive and that's what attracts me. It's not, necessarily the way what's depicted as much as the energy and the life that the artist brings to it. So so there's that, which is I don't know how well they work for other readers, but it was a lovely exercise to connect with those artists in that way, and then finishing with a series of poems that are about time, past, present and future in various ways. So that's kind of the rooms in Circadia.
So actually you try to move, so speaking of the ekphrastic poem, so you try to move away from the more denotative gesture, right? So it's not like you are illustrating the paintings, but you are to capture and go into your paintings, capture that kind of energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's just really fascinates me. We'll read a couple more poems, and one of those will be about a lyrical abstractionist painter, which is where the painting is also trying to depict energy and movement, and in an abstract way rather than by describing something that's seen literally. It's more really trying to get to the essence of yeah, something about the feeling of what's seen rather than the thing itself. So I think because we've only got 10 minutes left, maybe we'll finish up by reading 2 poems each. So yeah, do you want to start with yours?
Yep. So maybe I would read the poem on the fish at the very beginning. So this is about the fish and the mirror, and how like I compare myself to the fish and how I wear my face like a mirror. So this is called This Little Fish. This little fish. Our face bears us like a mirror from its depth watching. Here, I am here. For years, this core slaps, and yet it hardly breaks away from me by breaking the full circle of what's been reflecting. See, we are only strangers. You turn, for two, I'm turning. You stay unbroken like a trap within me, and yet not a rupture ever turns me away from being tinier with you. For I'm caught unseen from within turning. And again, through your tiniest titillations, you glow like a big scheme of something bigger in my throat, saying, come back, come back.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love the image of turning. You keep the poem is turning from line to line, and that image of the turning, which is also the image of the fish, is just beautiful in that poem. Yeah.
So, and then the other poem is the ending poem. So this is also about fish, but like how fish look at me as if I were their dreams. So it's called One Intimate Morning. One intimate morning. The first goldfish breathes life. The second one sleeps like a tuft of life for being a thoughtful gift. The third, mindful over the water, carries itself as a sanctuary. I come out the first ray this morning, very tenuous in the water, and the fish trimming every second. Coiled near their cheeks, the seaweed reticent in a tussock. I can't stop admiring their tapering greens, and meanwhile, million mysteries curling long at my fingertips. I'm the enigma at the center of now. The fish look at me as if I were their dream. I scatter more pellets, can't give more than a little inaudible rain.
Lovely. I'm the enigma at the center of now. That we should have used that as a subtitle for our talk. That's just really lovely. So I'm going to read a poem which is about an artist, Zhao Wuji, a Chinese-French artist that I discovered in a Parisian exhibition. And I'll just share a couple of links in the chat about Zhao Wuji because, yeah, he's a wonderful, wonderful artist. He's, as I said, a lyrical abstractionist artist, and very much worth discovering his work. I thought I had another link. He's also just a lot of his works have just been acquired by the M+
Museum in Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong. So for those of you
really
in
huge
Hong Kong,
coincidence.
Yeah, you should go and see these artworks when they get exhibited. And I wanted to read just this lovely quote from him. Beneath my brush, a space comes into being. As my mind rushes ahead, it begins to take shape, flying and spreading gracefully. And all this from the lightness of the brush strokes, the lightness of the colors, and the lightness of time's passing. And so my poem about Zhao Wuji's work is called Zhao Wuji and the Music of What Happens. And again, it's one of these poems where I'm trying to capture something about the way that the poem about the way that the paintings feel when I look at them, and how I feel that the feeling that Jiaowuji is perhaps captured in the brush strokes and the movement that's in the painting, rather than anything depicted, because it's abstract. So and the poem itself kind of moves across the page in spaced out lines, trying to capture some of that feeling as you read. So you have to move your eyes across the page in ways that a painting might, use its brush strokes. So Jiaowuji and the music of what happens. Painting not the body, but the feeling of life, how it brings us to life. This, then, the coming into being of motion, and between it, silence, tunneling through, like our hearts, not hearing each other, not sensing the need for attention and belief. You with your art, rising up to breathe company, fierce as the wind in a universe of fire and water, spume and smoke. And the last poem I'll read is called, and this is harking back to my reading of Heidegger's Being and Time. When I was an undergraduate, I've used the title Sein und Zeit, just to again evoke that sense of the tight coupling of existence and time. And this is a poem about the experience of a medical diagnosis, of walking into a room, as the poem says, not knowing, what that diagnosis will be, and the kind of existential moment that is. And in the poem, I try to walk the reader into the room and out again in a way that, might replicate that feeling of going into that room and what that might feel like. So, Sein und Zeit. We can walk into a room not knowing it doesn't happen every time. A white room can be painted to be pure. I mean, just to show us that it's clean, but it doesn't have to be. We can walk into a room not knowing whether or when, or even that can be the hardest room. Only you will know. First, there is the walking, the floor, a chair or two, the posters of visions of someone else's visit to a room. Take a chair. Only then the talk begins, like a reckoning of beads, like the body measures sweat, words wrong as a rainbow that has paled to a shadow of itself. There is always an end. We can stand and walk again. We can leave the room in silence, carrying its moment, in and out of days. There we go.
This is my favorite poem in the book.
Oh, thank you. It's one that means a lot to me personally. So I'm glad you said that. Well, I guess it's time for us to wrap up and say thank you to everyone who came along. Thank you, Rosanna and Simon and Han and Paige and Jaya. Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a lovely evening to spend with you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Stay well.
Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.